Alright, so we'll be starting in just a few minutes. As soon as more people join the session, then we'll get started. Okay, so in today's session, we are going to be covering the peritoneum, and some of the abdominal organs. Okay, we're not going to focus on too much on the muscles itself and the borders of the abdomen, but it's mainly on the digestive system. So what we are going to be talking about essentially is the stomach, the small intestine, focusing mainly on the duodenum, and then we'll talk briefly about the jejunum and the ileum as well, the gallbladder, as well as the common bile duct and the pancreas. And yeah, so those will be the main sessions that we are going to be focusing on today, and that will also include a small talk about the cecum as well, and the appendix and the blood supply that supplies all of these organs. Okay, so I think we'll get started, and then eventually more people will join the sessions. And anyway, these recordings will be available on my channel, so you guys can go through them and listen to the recording later on when you have time. Right, now when we talk about the peritoneum, there are certain structures that you need to remember, including the parietal peritoneum, visceral peritoneum. What is the difference between them and where do they start? So now everything starts at the back, where we have what we call the root of the mesentery, which is essentially the attachment of the duplicature of the posterior abdominal wall. So with the posterior abdominal wall, and from there we have the root of the mesentery. Now the root of the mesentery is the one that gives rise to the parietal peritoneum as well as to the visceral peritoneum. Now the parietal peritoneum is found around the peritoneal cavity, so it's essentially lining the entire cavity itself, as you can see from this picture in red. While the visceral peritoneum is the layer that essentially wraps all the intra-abdominal organs, including the colon, small intestines, the liver, all of these structures. So essentially the visceral peritoneum, you cannot distinguish. It's a very thin layer that wraps around these organs. So even during dissections, you might have seen there is a very tiny whitish layer that wraps around the organs, and if you're careful enough, you should be able to peel it off from the organs, especially from the liver, since it being quite big organ itself. You should be able to remove the visceral peritoneum from that organ very easily. Okay, so essentially all the organs are hanging due to the visceral peritoneum within the peritoneal cavity, as you see in this picture. Okay, so usually this is not an area that comes at SEQ, but it can be assessed during Viva as well. They might ask about the peritoneum and the layers covering the peritoneum. So the keywords here that you need to remember: root of the mesentery with parietal peritoneum and visceral peritoneum. You should know the differences and how they emerge into the peritoneal cavity. Okay, now with that said, we can move on to talk about the blood supply. So now the entire blood supply for the digestive system, comes from the abdominal aorta. Okay, so it starts from the level of T12. It's a continuation of the thoracic aorta, and this is a very popular question that comes for SEQs as well, and you can be assessed on Viva as well. Okay, mostly on SEQs. Now, as I said, it starts from T11, T12, just as it descends from the diaphragm. There are what we call main branches, and then there are branches accessory branches that come out from the abdominal aorta. Now, for in terms of SCQ as well as for your OSCE exam, you need to be thoroughly familiar with the main branches. So the way we remember them are based on the levels of the lumbar vertebrae and thoracic vertebrae. So we start from T12 and then we descend down L1, L2, L3 and L4. So there are differences at each level. Now at T12 we have one of the main branches that is very popular in SEQs as well as OSCEs, and that's the celiac trunk. So we will talk a little bit more in detail about celiac trunk. Going down to L1 level, then we have the superior mesenteric artery. At L2 we have the renal arteries. L3 we have the inferior mesenteric artery, and then finally at L4 we have the common iliac artery. So the bifurcation of the abdominal aorta into the common iliac arteries that eventually become the internal iliac and the external iliac arteries. Okay, so those are the main arteries, and you'll definitely be asked at OSCE to recognize some of these structures. The most predominant one that they usually give, because it's easier on the eye, is the celiac trunk. It's a much bigger trunk that divides into three, and because being the first branch of the abdominal aorta, it's easier to distinguish even from far away. So they tend to use the easier ones for you guys for the OSCE exam. Okay. Right, so those are the branches, and then looking at the accessory branches, we have the inferior phrenic artery. We also have the superior phrenic artery, but that comes from the thoracic aorta. The inferior phrenic is the one that comes from the abdominal aorta. From the inferior phrenic, then we have the first branch that supplies the adrenal glands, which is also called the suprarenal gland. So this is what we call the superior suprarenal branch, and then we have another one here which is called the middle suprarenal branch, and we also have the inferior suprarenal branch that comes from the renal artery. Okay, so there are three branches: superior, middle and inferior, that supplies the adrenal glands that are basically sitting on top of the kidneys. Right, and then L1 superior mesenteric, L2 we have the renal arteries going either way to supply both kidneys. Okay, we're not going to talk about the branches of the renal artery today. Then moving further down, we have the branches for the ureteric, ureter, so the ureteric branches, and we have the gonadal branches. Now obviously you have to mention here the differences between male and female. So in female we'll have the ovarian artery, in males we have the testicular arteries. Okay, so there's a difference that you need to keep in mind. So obviously, to keep it gender neutral here, the gonadal artery. Now here we have the lumbar arteries on either way. So the difference from this picture and what the reality is that these branches are found at each lumbar vertebra. So start from L1 to L4. Okay, so this diagram is a little bit wrong by having drawn all of this here. So that should be drawn at each lumbar vertebra. Okay, so this is what we call the lumbar vertebra. And then finally we have the median sacral artery at the bifurcation of the abdominal aorta. Alright, so these are essentially the branches of the abdominal artery, and I don't think I've seen a question, an SEQ question directed to the abdominal aorta where you had to draw the entire abdominal aorta, but it could be a possibility because they're always trying to come up with new and newer questions since they keep on repeating the same questions, right? For SEQs, it's mostly always the gallbladder or something related to the duodenum, the stomach. There could be questions on the differences between the jejunum and the ileum. So there are very common pattern questions that you can practice, but there are also some new questions that they're trying to come up with. So this could be a potential question that they can come up with. Okay, from the abdominal aorta, what I've seen so far, they usually ask questions on the celiac trunk, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, where you have to draw those arteries out with all the branches, and also talk a little bit about what those branches supply. Okay, so that's usually the usual pattern of questions that I've seen, but again, the full abdominal aorta could be asked as well as an SEQ question where you have to draw it out. So practice on drawing out the abdominal aorta. So at the same time, you'll also be practicing all the branches coming from the celiac, superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Okay. So as usual, if you have questions, obviously drop them into the comment section. We'll discuss them as we go. Okay, now we are looking into a little bit more detail about the celiac trunk. So we said it comes from T12 level, right? So it's the first main branch coming from the abdominal aorta. Now let's go and see what are the main branches. So from here we have three main branches. One being on the left is the splenic artery that goes to supply the spleen. Then we have the left gastric artery, and then we also have the common hepatic artery. Okay, now the left gastric artery goes on to supply the lesser curvature of the stomach. We will see about the stomach in a bit, but just keep in mind it supplies that area of the stomach. Splenic artery, as we said, supplies the spleen mainly, but also then the splenic artery divides and gives certain branches, including the left gastroepiploic artery, which supplies the greater curvature of the stomach. Yes, I was just looking what this other branch was. This is the says pancreatic branch. Okay, we'll talk about that later. But mainly, okay, the left gastroepiploic artery. Now the common hepatic artery, it divides and forms what we call the proper hepatic artery. But before doing that, it gives out to the right gastric artery that supplies the rest of the lesser curvature of the stomach, and the gastroduodenal artery, which divides into two. The gastroduodenal gives out to the right gastroepiploic artery to supply the greater curvature of the stomach together with the left gastroepiploic, and it gives out to the duodenal branch, which also divides into the superior pancreatico-duodenal artery. Okay, so it supplies both the duodenum as well as the pancreas. And then once it gives out these two branches, it forms the proper hepatic artery, which divides into the left hepatic artery and the right hepatic artery. Those supply the two lobes of the liver. Okay, so this is something that you need to be able to draw. Okay, so everything that we discussed here, all these branches need to be drawn out. So you should be very familiar with this diagram. If they ask something about the stomach, then a diagram of the celiac trunk is very important when you describe the blood supply of the stomach. If they ask about the stomach, the blood supply will definitely be there as a question, as well as the lymph drainage. So when you describe the blood supply, this diagram should be drawn. Okay, so they are going to be very indirect questions. They're not going to be asking directly from you to draw the celiac trunk. That will never happen. But as an indirect question, they will expect you to draw the celiac trunk as part of your answer. Okay, and then now we're moving towards the branches of the superior and the inferior mesenteric artery. So what we're seeing here is a superior mesenteric artery that comes from L1 level. The superior mesenteric gives branches to the jejunum and to the ileum. So that's what we call the jejunal and the ileal arteries. And then we have the ileocholic artery. Now the ileocholic artery has superior and inferior branches, two branches. From the superior branch, then it gives out the appendicular artery. Now the appendicular artery is the branch that supplies this structure, which is the vermiform appendix coming from the cecum of the colon. Okay, so this is the cecum and this is the vermiform appendix. So it comes here and supplies the vermiform appendix. So that's what we call the appendicular artery for the appendix essentially. And then we have the right colic artery that supplies the right colon. Okay, so this is the right colon, this is the transverse colon. So actually ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon. Okay, so this can also be called the right and left colons. And then sigmoid colon, and eventually leads to the rectum. And then the final branch coming from the superior mesenteric is the middle colic artery that supplies the superior part of the right colon and part 2/3 of the transverse colon. The other third of the transverse colon and the descending colon, those are supplied by the inferior mesenteric, which we'll be seeing in just a moment. Okay, so keep that in mind. So this is how you're supposed to draw it out. You can draw the colon, or otherwise you can just draw the branches coming up from the superior mesenteric and make sure that you annotate the diagram as seen in this picture. Okay, so you can, if you draw something like this, they'll give a certain amount of marks, but something missing from this picture is the vermiform appendix, the artery going to the vermiform appendix. Okay, so if you remember that, you remember to break down the ileocholic artery into the superior and inferior branches, you're obviously going to get more marks out of your diagram. Right, so then what we're seeing here is the inferior mesenteric artery, and so you can see that the left colic artery is supplying the distal 1/3 of the transverse colon and the descending colon. And from the inferior mesenteric, we also have the sigmoid arteries. Now the amount of branches that go to the sigmoid artery can vary from body to body, but usually it's between 3 to 5 branches that supplies the sigmoid colon. So in this diagram is not obviously evident, but keep in mind that in your answer you should say there can be between 3 to 5 branches that supply the sigmoid colon. And then finally, one other branch that is not annotated here is the superior rectal artery. Okay, so as the name suggests, supplies the rectum, more specifically the ampulla of the rectum. Okay, and this is usually coming not directly, sometimes it can come directly from the inferior mesenteric, or otherwise it comes as anastomosis from the sigmoid arteries. So it's essentially a continuation of the sigmoid arteries. Okay, so it's much simpler. Obviously the inferior mesenteric is much simpler diagram to draw out, but keep that in mind. Okay, and another thing that you could include to be more specific is that the left colic has superior and inferior branches. Okay, the superior branch is the one that supplies the transverse colon, the superior part of the descending colon. The inferior branch is the one that supplies the distal part of the distal colon. Okay, so then that concludes the abdominal aorta. Okay, I hope that everything is clear. I see no questions. Okay, so this diagram is very important. You should be able to draw out the entire abdominal aorta in its entirety with the accessory branches and the main branches, and then all the branches, side branches, they come from the celiac trunk, superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric. Okay, so I hope that as you guys are preparing for your SCQs, for your final exam, that these things will be coming natural to you. Okay, these are easy questions to answer, especially with the diagrams sort of questions should be at your fingertips. You should be able to answer these questions very easily. Okay, right, so now we are going to be looking at the gallbladder. So the first abdominal organ that we are going to be seeing. Now this is again another diagram that you should be familiar with. So both of these two diagrams together. Okay, so what we are seeing here, so this one is looking at the structure of the gallbladder in its entirety. We have the fundus followed by the body. Before the neck, actually we have the infundibulum. So this is not seen in this diagram. Infundibulum, neck, and then the cystic duct that connects to the hepatic duct. So you can see here the left and right hepatic ducts that form together the common hepatic duct. Okay, so this one comes from the left lobe, this comes from the right lobe, joined together they form the hepatic duct, common hepatic duct, and then once the cystic duct emerges and joins the common hepatic duct, the common bile duct is formed. Okay, now the common bile duct has different parts. Okay, so you need to be familiar with. So if you are asked to draw the different parts of the common bile duct, you need to name them as the supraduodenal part, the retroduodenal part, and then the pancreatic part. And what we have here is the intramural part, because here essentially we have the duodenum. Okay, so this section here called the hepatopancreatic ampulla vata, it's found within the duodenum. So those are the four regions that you need to know: supraduodenal, retroduodenal, pancreatic part, and the intramural part as it joins the duodenum. Okay, so this is the final drawing that you're supposed to show. Now from here there is also something called the triangle of Carlet, which is found here between the cystic duct, the common hepatic duct, and the liver. The liver is essentially hanging just up here with a cystic duct going inside the liver. So the borders again of the triangles of Carlet are the inferior margin of the liver, the cystic duct, and the common hepatic duct. And it has content. It has the cystic artery and cystic vein running through that triangle. Okay, so there's again another question that comes up at SEQs. So remember the contents and the borders. Cystic artery, obviously as the name suggests, it supplies the gallbladder. Okay, so I think that's easy to remember. Alright, so now we need to have a look a little bit more detail about the pancreas and how it's connected also to the duodenum. So now the duodenum, we know it's a structure that usually is about 25 to 30 centimeters long. I think last anatomy says 25 centimeters. So there are three structures within the abdomen and actually within the body that are measured about 25 centimeters. One being the esophagus, the other one being the ureter, and the other one being the duodenum. Now the duodenum has four parts: D1, D2, D3, D4. But you can't just name them like that. You also need to know the name that is given for each of these structures. D1 is what we call the superior part. Then we have the D2, which is the descending part, D3, which is the inferior part, and D4, which is the ascending part. Okay, so those are the four sections of the duodenum, but we are going to focus mainly on D2, which is the descending part. So within the descending part, there are two important structures to remember. One being this one, which is the major duodenal papilla of Vater, which we saw just here when we were talking about the gallbladder. Okay, so hepatic pancreatic ampulla of Vata. And the other one, which is not shown here, is the minor duodenal papilla of Santorini. Okay, so those are the two sections that you need to remember from the duodenum. So if you are asked to draw the duodenum at D2, you need to show the two papilla, the major duodenal papilla of Vata and the minor duodenal papilla of Santorini. So the major duodenal papilla of Vata is the point at which the common bile duct essentially joins to the duodenum and releases all that bile that is stored within the gallbladder or that comes directly from the liver. Comes down through the common bile duct and emerges here at the duodenum. But we saw there was also a small contribution that comes from the pancreas, right? So if you look at the picture of the pancreas, we have what we call the pancreatic duct that runs throughout the pancreas and connects at the major duodenum of Vata. Okay, so you can see the common bile duct here together with the pancreatic duct. They merge together and they release their content into the duodenum. So likewise, there is another structure, another pancreatic duct, which we call the accessory pancreatic duct. It's not visible here in this picture. Okay, so you can see it here. So you can see here the accessory pancreatic duct. It emerges and it fuses with the duodenum and forms the minor duodenal papilla of Santorini. So it also releases content through that foramen as well. Now, when it comes to the duodenum, one of the any question that gets usually asked for the duodenum or for any of the abdominal organs is the relations of these organs to the other organs of the abdomen. So that's something that you'll have to by heart unless you have good regional anatomy knowledge. Then this is something that I would say is the hardest part that a lot of people are not able to answer in the SCQs are the relations. Okay, so now in terms of relations, so you need, let's see if we can find the picture for that. Okay, so this gives you a small idea about the regional anatomy. So this can be divided into the different parts of the duodenum, right? So the first part, we can say it's closely associated with the gallbladder, it's associated with the right suprarenal gland and the right kidney and the common bile duct. And then if you move to the second part, they can be more associated with the transverse colon and the right kidney, the ureter. So likewise, I'll keep that that section for you guys to go through. Okay, so read Last Anatomy, they have a good section on this. Also Ellis is much more concise version. It gives all the relations that you need to know. Okay, so this is the hardest part, like I said, because every single organ they can ask those questions, like stomach, what are the relations to the stomach, what are the relations for the kidneys, what are the relations for the duodenum, so pancreas. Okay, so if you have a good understanding of this picture or something like this, then you'll be able to remember the relations. Okay, let me see if I mentioned everything. Right, so one thing that I didn't mention was about the blood supply of the duodenum. So we saw earlier the celiac trunk, right? And it gave out a gastroduodenal branch. We have the gastroduodenal branch coming here, and it gives out the duodenal branch and the superior pancreatico-duodenal branch. Okay, so the superior pancreatic duodenal branch will divide into what we call the anterior and the posterior branch. So both of them will be supplying the duodenum, and we also have the inferior pancreatico-duodenal branch that comes from the superior mesenteric artery. So those are the main branches supplying the duodenum. Superior pancreatic duodenal, which has two branches, anterior and posterior, and the inferior pancreatico-duodenal artery comes from the superior mesenteric artery. Okay, so those are the blood supply for the duodenum. So now we can focus on the stomach. So I think again there are no questions. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask your questions, okay, and I'll answer them as we go. Okay, now the stomach, the basic part of the stomach. Now we have the esophagus here and the cardia, which is basically the opening into the stomach, and then this opens into the fundus of the stomach. So this region is called the fundus of the stomach, which is followed by the body of the stomach. So this entire section is the body, okay, the body, and the last part is what we call the pyloric part or the pylorus. So it includes the pylorus itself, the pyloric canal with the pyloric sphincter, and the pyloric orifice, okay, the pyloric antrum. So those are the regions of the pyloric part. So it's the cardia, fundus, body, and the pyloric part. Now for the stomach we have two surfaces. We have what we call the anterior wall and the posterior wall. So those are important again when it comes to the relations. Okay, so in terms of relations, now the anterior wall faces the diaphragm and the liver, and for the posterior the diaphragm, the liver, and the anterior abdominal wall. For the posterior wall of the stomach, we have the diaphragm, left kidney, left suprarenal gland, we have the pancreas, the spleen, and the transverse mesocolon. So I cannot find a picture to show you guys. Let me see if I can find one. Okay. Okay, so this is the anterior wall of the stomach. We have the liver, we have the diaphragm, and the anterior abdominal wall. So this is the anterior region, and then if you look posteriorly, this we have the spleen, we have the kidneys, the pancreas, and the colon mesocolic surface, the adrenal gland, and the diaphragm. Okay, so this is the diagram that you should be able to draw to show the anterior and the posterior relations of the stomach. This is a question that you need to practice on how to draw it, okay, because if the stomach is asked, then you'll have to demonstrate this. Okay, now going back to the stomach, earlier we mentioned the lesser curvature of the stomach and the greater curvature of the stomach, right? The lesser curvature of the stomach was supplied by the left gastric artery, which was a direct branch of the celiac trunk, and the right gastric artery, which comes from the common hepatic artery. And then the right and left gastroepiploic arteries supplied by the gastroduodenal and from the splenic artery that supplies the greater curvature of the stomach. Okay, so those are the general parts um, of the stomach. Now there are ways to fixate the stomach to the surrounding organs. So there are ligaments. There are 4 ligaments that you need to remember. One is the hepatogastric ligament, which runs this way sideways towards the right, because it's the hepato ligament, so it's connected to the liver. Okay, so the lesser curvature of the stomach is connected to the liver. So that's the first one, hepatogastric. Then we have the gastrosplenic ligament, as the name suggests, is connected to the overlying spleen. So we'll be going this way from the fundus to the spleen. And then we have the gastrophrenic ligament, which is a connection between the stomach and the diaphragm. And likewise, there is also the gastrocolic ligament between the transverse colon and the stomach. So 4 ligaments: hepatogastric, gastrosplenic, gastrophrenic, and gastrocolic. Okay, so all of these questions, all of these points that I'm mentioning fall under the structure of the stomach. Okay, so everything I mentioned is, everything should fall with the diagram under the structure of the stomach. And with that, there is also one more point that needs to be mentioned, which is about the muscles that create the stomach. So usually these are all what do we call them, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and so the word is not coming to mind right now, but there are 3 muscles. They're autonomic, so it's on the involuntary action, so you guys are not able to control these muscles. Okay, and there are 3 types. So usually we have 2 within everywhere else in the body, which are the circular layer and the longitudinal layer. But in the stomach we have an additional layer, which is called the internal oblique layer. So the first one that you see here, internal oblique, yeah, there you go, thank you Dulita, smooth muscles. Okay. Right, like a smooth muscles. So 3 layers: the internal oblique layer, the circular layer of muscles, followed with the most external one, which is the longitudinal layer of muscle. Okay, so distinguishable point there. And inside, what you can see here, these are what we call the rugae. So what is the importance of the rugae? Is to increase the surface area for the absorption of food. So eventually the stomach, as more and more food comes into the stomach will expand. So the rugae essentially will disappear, will flatten, and that increases essentially the surface area of the stomach. That's the only functionality. I don't think at any point in your anatomy exam you'll have to mention about the functionality of the rugae, but yeah, just keep that in mind. Okay, and yeah, so that's an overall picture about the structure, and we also mentioned about some of the blood supply that supplies the greater curvature and the lesser curvature of the stomach. Okay, now going back towards the blood supply, so we mentioned about the greater and lesser curvatures. We need to talk about the fundus itself, because there are certain branches coming from the splenic artery which we call the short gastric arteries. Okay, so those come directly from the splenic artery and supply the fundus and part of the body as well. And then we also have a pyloric artery, which is a smaller branch that comes from the hepatic artery proper. Okay, from the proper hepatic artery it comes and supplies the pylorus. Okay, so I think those were the only 2 branches that we didn't mention. And then we had the 2 main branches, the right and left gastroepiploic and left and right gastric arteries. They supply the lesser curvature of the stomach. Alright, so that's in a nutshell the blood supply. Now another question that they ask, two more questions actually. One is about the lymph drainage. So I think that's the next thing that I had. Yeah. Lymph drainage. Now this is a question worth about 20 to 25 marks. So it would be a waste if you guys are not able to answer this question. This you can find also in Alice, gives a good description about the lymph drainage. Now there are three areas that you need to talk about. This is the first area, including the fundus, the body, and the pyloric part. Then we have the second area. This is area number 2, and this is area number 3. So there isn't much they need to say. You need to be able to draw this diagram and separate the stomach in these three portions and call this area 1, area 2, and area 3. Now if you take area 1, all you need to say is that the lymph drainage for area 1 goes to the right and the left gastric vessels. So essentially the vessels that supply the lesser curvature of the stomach. And then from there, all the lymph will be directed to the aortic nodes. Area 2 instead drains basically what we call the subpyloric region, and it eventually goes to the what we call the subpyloric nodes, and from the subpyloric nodes then it goes to the aortic nodes. Okay, so it uses the right gastric epiploic artery to do so. So from the right gastric epiploic it goes to the subpyloric nodes and then finally to the aortic node. And if we take area 3, it uses the splenic arteries, splenic vessels, and then from there it's directed to what we call the suprapancreatic nodes, and from the suprapancreatic nodes it goes to the aortic nodes. So eventually overall all the lymph drainage of the stomach will be directed to the aortic nodes, but you need to remember that it uses certain vessels, the vessels closer to that area, in order to drain all the lymph. So again, right and left gastric vessels for the area number 1, and it goes through directly into the aortic nodes. Part number 2, it goes to the right gastroepiploic artery, and then from there it goes to the subpyloric nodes, and then it's directed to the aortic nodes. Part number 3, or area number 3, it goes to the splenic vessels, and from there it goes to the suprapancreatic nodes, and then finally to the aortic nodes. Okay, so it's very simple question to answer, 25 marks. You draw this diagram out, and then it's essentially 3 sentences to describe the lymphatic drainage for area number 1, 2, and 3. And then finally, the last question that they usually ask about the stomach is the histology. So now, if you haven't done so already, all of the histology slides will be found here at histologyguide.com. So you can go through this website and answer and basically find out for yourself all these histological slides and the different parts of the organs that you'll be looking at. So now the stomach is divided into 4 sections histologically: the mucosa, submucosa, the muscularis layer, and the adventitia. So the mucosa will be the most inner section. So this is the mucosa. This is what we call the muscularis propria, and muscularis externa, and then finally the adventitia. So if we click on these regions, it directs us straight to the mucosa, where you'll find the gastric pits. These are what we call the gastric pits, again to part of the ruga to increase surface area. And there are also what we call the gastric glands that secrete essentially all that hydrochloric acid, right? So that's followed by a muscularis mucosa, which is this thin layer that you see here just underneath the glands, and that leads us to the submucosa that you see. And then from the submucosa we are going to the muscularis externa, where we find the 3 layers of muscles that we mentioned, which are the oblique muscle, the internal oblique muscle, the longitudinal muscle, and the circular layer. Okay, so you can click on each of these regions and see the 3 different regions. And then finally we have the adventitia, which is essentially hard connective tissue, where you can also find vessels, as you can see here. Now, question for you guys that I want you to answer. I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to distinguish this. So this is something that will come up in your OSCE exam as well. One of these structures is an artery and the other one is a vein. So we're looking at these 2 big vessels here. So which one is the artery, which one is the vein? So which one is the what is the left structure, what is the right structure? Someone can answer in the comment section. So this is essentially a potential OSCE that can come up for your exam. They'll give you 45 seconds to answer this question. Which one is the vein? Which one is the artery? Can someone tell me? Okay, no one seems to be answering, but essentially what we're seeing here on the left is the vein. Okay, thanks Dulita. Yeah, the left is the vein and the other one is the artery, yeah, because of the thick wall that you see. There are different ways to distinguish between veins and arteries. One is the shape. So you can see this is a little bit, the shape is a little bit distorted, and the artery itself is very circular in shape and it's very thick compared to this. Okay, so those are easy ways for you to distinguish between the arteries and veins. Okay, it's a gifted question essentially. Okay, this is a very straightforward question that I hope no one will get wrong. It's very easy to get marks on these sort of questions. Okay, so that concludes then the section on the stomach. We saw the structure, the histology, the blood supply, the ligaments. Okay, so everything was discussed, and those are the sort of questions that come up on SEQ. Right, so then now we are going to talk about the rest of the small intestine and the large intestine. So the common question that gets asked for the small intestine is the difference between jejunum and ileum. So this is something that you'll be able to find in your ALICE. It gives out 5 points that you need to be able to recollect during the exam in order to gain those 5 marks. So the first one is that the jejunum has a thicker wall. So the mucosa is much larger and is thicker compared to the ileum. So even in this picture you can see that they've drawn it a little bit thicker compared to the ileum. I don't know whether this was done intentionally or not, but jejunum is much thicker compared to the ileum. Okay, and usually in terms of length, the jejunum is much longer compared to the ileum, and the jejunum is usually found within the umbilical region, and the ileum is found within the suprapubic region and the pelvis, and the mesentery is usually much thicker and it contains more fat when it goes from the jejunum to the ileum. And then finally the last point that you can see here is that the jejunum has 1 to 2 rows of what we call arterial arcades, while in the ileum this is much richer. There are about 4 to 5 rows of arterial arcades. Okay, so these are the 5 differences, the 5 points, usually worth between 25 to 30 marks on an SEQ question. Okay, so starting from the mucosa being more thicker, the mesentery being thicker with more fat, the arterial arcades having one or two rows of arterial arcades within the jejunum, and the location of the jejunum compared to the ileum. Jejunum is found within the umbilical region, and the ileum found within towards more closer to the pelvis. Okay, and the length. Jejunum is much longer compared to the ileum. The general length of the small intestine can run between 3 to 5 meters. Okay, and then the cecum and the vermiform appendix. Now, two questions that are usually asked here are the positions of the vermiform appendix. There are 6 positions. Here in this diagram there are shown 5, but there is also another one. The most common position is the retrocecal position, which basically runs behind the cecum. With that we have the post-ileal and the pre-ileal positions, the pelvic and the subcecal position. The one missing here is the lateral cecal position, which usually runs in this direction like this, lateral to the cecum. Okay, so those are the 6 positions, and remember the retrocecal is the most common position. They could ask as a question, what are the positions of the cecum? So they won't say 6 even, you'll have to write them down. You have to remember that there are 6, and with that they can also ask what is the commonest position, so the retrocecal. And with that they'll also ask about the blood supply of the vermiform appendix, which we saw earlier. It comes from the appendicular branch, which is a branch of the superior mesenteric artery, right? So there you can even make a diagram about the superior mesenteric, the branches that it gives out, and how the appendicular branch is formed and supplies the cecum. Sorry, not the cecum, the vermiform appendix. Right, and then we'll talk quickly about the pancreas, which is the last organ that I in mind for today. Okay, I know it's a lot of information, but these are the things that they'll be expecting from you guys, SCQs and Viva. Okay, so we have discussed a lot of the things that will be asked at SCQs, but all of these questions can also be asked during your Viva. Okay, so pancreas is usually a very common question that gets asked during Viva as well. So now this basic structure of the pancreas, we have the head, followed by the neck, body, tail, and the uncinate process. There isn't a really functionality for the uncinate process, but it's almost a small tail that hangs from the head. Okay, and there are 2 important structures running here between the neck and the uncinate process, which is not shown here. Let's see if I can. Yeah, you can see them here in this diagram. We have the superior mesenteric artery and vein running between the neck and the uncinate process. Okay, so that's again a 5 to 10 mark question asked during SEQ. What are the structures, a close related structure that runs between the neck and the uncinate process? Superior mesenteric artery and the superior mesenteric vein. Right, so that's essentially the structure. Now we can talk about the ductal system of the pancreas, which we saw earlier as well. We have the main pancreatic duct and the accessory pancreatic duct. So this is the main pancreatic duct, this is the accessory pancreatic duct, okay, coming together. So obviously we are not going to talk about much about the exocrine and endocrine functions of the pancreas here. That's more physiology, but that's essentially what's being released here in these 2 tubes. We have a lot of pancreatic enzymes that get released into the duodenum to break down the food that you digest, that you eat essentially. Okay, pancreatic lipases to break down fats are released from the pancreas. Okay, Okay, so the accessory pancreatic duct, which is connected to the minor duodenal papilla of Santorini, and this one is the major duodenal papilla of Vata. Okay, those are the complete names. So those are the names that you're supposed to write down. Some people just write minor duodenal papilla or major duodenal papilla. It won't give you obviously the full marks. You have to remember to write Santorini and Vata as part of your answer. Okay, and the common bile duct, we said it connects with the main pancreatic duct at the major duodenal papilla of Vata. With what we call here within the muscle, there is a smooth muscle called the sphincter of Oddi. Okay, so you can mention that as well in your diagram, and you can say that's basically to regulate the function of the common bile duct and the main pancreatic duct in the release of bile and pancreatic enzymes. Okay, then in terms of syncope is again a very important part of your gross anatomy of the pancreas. So this is the diagram that you want to draw for the syncope of the pancreas. So you can see how many organs there are around, and you need to be able to, if you can draw it, it would be awesome. They'll give a lot of marks for this. But I know a lot of people won't be drawing this, but if you can practice this drawing, it can be very important and a good way for you to show the syncope and to gain those marks. Okay, so this diagram in itself is also helping you to answer the, questions related to the syncope of the duodenum and the kidneys and the spleen. Okay, it's not just the pancreas. Okay, then the last part is about the arterial supply. So again, celiac trunk and the superior mesenteric artery are the two main branches responsible for the supply of the pancreas. So from the celiac trunk, we have the superior pancreatico-duodenal artery with the anterior and posterior branches, and from the superior mesenteric, we have the inferior pancreatico-duodenal artery. Then there are also pancreatic branches coming from the splenic artery. So the splenic artery will give the pancreatic branches and will supply the body and the tail. And there is also another branch from the splenic artery called this pancreatica magna artery. If you read last anatomy, I think as far as I remember from last anatomy, it's also highlighted in bold as far as I remember. Pancreatica magna artery comes from the splenic artery and supplies the pancreas directly. Okay, so those are the branches: anterior and posterior superior pancreatico-duodenal artery and the inferior pancreatico-duodenal artery from the superior mesenteric artery, the pancreatic branches from the splenic artery, and the pancreatica magna artery again from the splenic artery. Okay, so that gives an overall account on the pancreas as well. So that's what I wanted to go through with you guys today. Are there any questions that you guys want to ask, or any sections that you'd like me to go through prior to your exams? Alright then, so yeah, as usual, use your WhatsApp group. If there's anything that you want me to go through, let me know. The next time we'll be continuing with the abdominal organs. We haven't done kidneys, ureter, so we'll go through the missing organs and we'll talk about the thorax as well. And I might also do a SEQ session on what we have seen today. just to complete this section overall. So if there's anything, obviously let me know. So I'll see you guys in the next session. So again, if there's anything, let me know, and thank you for joining today's session, and I'll see you guys in the next video.